Thank you, Dimitri. I very much appreciate the invitation to join this group. And I'd like to take about 10 minutes just to share some of my thoughts about the questions that you put to us and the topic of the day. It seems to me the deepest problem with the anchoring of democracy in today's Russia is that not enough of the demos, not enough of the people of Russia actually want a democratic system. And no democratic system can survive for very long without a firm anchor in the population at large. One of the consequences of the shallowness of democracy's roots in Russia is a sense of impunity on the part of the leadership. And this has been true for quite a long time, going back into the Soviet period. One of the areas of research that I conducted for my book on the history of the dissident movement involved looking at the transcripts of Politburo discussions of what to do with dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and others. And there's a memorable line from one of those discussions about what to do with Sakharov. Should he be imprisoned? Should he be exiled? They couldn't send him abroad because he knew far too much about the Soviet nuclear weapons program. But in one of those conversations, a member of the Politburo, this is in the late 1970s, a man named Nikolai Podgorny, said to his fellow Politburo members, including Leonid Brezhnev, the general secretary of the party, the people will support whatever action we take. And no one disagreed with him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the crux of the problem. The leadership perceives itself as being able to act with almost complete impunity vis-a-vis its own population. Now, Andrei Sakharov wrote a lot about democracy and human rights and international relations. We could spend hours going through his ideas and trying to adapt them to current circumstances. I want to do two things. I want to highlight what I think is his most original idea and also very often overlooked idea about human rights. And then I want to use Andrei Sakharov as an example of someone who did not begin as a Democrat, who was not committed to multi-party democracy as the ideal system for making political decisions about the common good, but who became a Democrat over time, and therefore offers an example of how people in today's Russia might find their way to a commitment to democratic forms of rule. So first, Sakharov's idea about human rights that I think is so stunningly original. Most people, and I'm deriving this largely from his arguably most famous essay, the 1968 Reflections on Peaceful Coexistence, Intellectual Freedom, and Progress. Most people regard human rights as a technique to constrain the power of states, to put limits on what states can do, either to their own people or to other people outside the country, since human rights are universal and are not specific to citizenship. Sakharov embraced that idea, but he took it much further in a way that I think is highly relevant today. And that is that Sakharov focused on human rights and specifically on the right of free exchange of information and the right to freely discuss information without fear as not just a constraint on raison d'etat, of the logic of state behavior, but also as an element of state behavior. And that the free exchange of information was so important for intelligent decision-making, that is to say, decision-making based on a full confrontation with the facts, on a full weighing of arguments for and against any given policy, that you couldn't have an effective and rational raison d'etat or statecraft without the right of free flow of information and discussion being built into it. So in his view, in that essay, and I think ever since that essay, he represented the argument that human rights were not only a set of limits on state behavior, but should be an element into the process of decision-making inside states themselves. It's a radical idea that I think has not received the amount of attention that it should. Now about Sakharov and democracy. In that same essay from 1968, as is well known, Sakharov articulated a position that could be described more accurately as technocratic than democratic. And in this, I think he was entirely representative of the dissident movement as a whole, which, like many people inside and outside the Soviet Union, feared that the challenges facing modern countries and modern states were simply too complex, too nuanced, too detailed to be trusted to the decisions of the masses in the form of some version of democracy. And in that essay, Sakharov expressed a preference for the members of the intelligentsia to be brought in as consultants to the state to help solve problems whose complexity was beyond the capacity of the population at large. And furthermore, to think on a global level about problems that ultimately required global and not national solutions. And these were at the time, but some of them still are, problems like what to do with nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, global pollution, problems of radiation, food supply, and population growth. Some of those problems are still with us in the form of climate change and the management of nuclear weapons. Some of them have receded to the back burner, but the argument still stands that those are problems that can only be solved on a global level, not on a national one. And Sakharov at the time was convinced that only experts in various fields could rise to the occasion of giving governments the kind of advice they needed to effectively confront these problems. So he was not, I would say, a fan of a multi-party democracy. And like many Soviet intellectuals, he looked at the real existing examples of multi-party democracy, and he saw a high degree of chaos, inability to come to conclusive decisions about crucial problems that couldn't wait to be addressed, and in general was not terribly inspired by the political decision-making of the Western democracies. I think you will all agree with me that the current spectacle of Western democracies is no better than it was in 1968, and in many cases, including the American, looks far worse, far less impressive, far less coherent, far less capable of rising to the occasion of the truly pressing problems that we face. So what turned Sakharov away from his skepticism about democracy and turned him into an explicit supporter of multi-party systems with all of the messiness and time-consuming processes of coming to decisions? I think, and here I'm leaning on the excellent analysis by Jay Bergman in his intellectual biography of Sakharov, that the single most important factor in turning Sakharov into a Democrat was named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Because the more Sakharov learned of Solzhenitsyn's remarkably more authoritarian, not to say archaic, approach to dealing with problems like global pollution, nuclear warfare, the more Sakharov learned about Solzhenitsyn's desire to maintain a high degree of concentrated power in the hands of the leadership, the less he liked that model, and the more he thought seriously about the safeguards that true intellectual competition in the form of a multi-party system can provide. This, I think, is at least an example on the part of someone who thought very deeply about these problems of how a conversion towards democracy can take place. And my view is that that conversion of the Russian population of today is more necessary than ever, because Western countries can do whatever they want by way of instituting sanctions or supporting NGOs. Russia could even conceivably lose the war against Ukraine. The sanctions that have been instituted could conceivably start to have some actual bite, which until this time they really haven't, or at least far below expectations. But nothing will secure the future of democracy in Russia unless the Russian people want democracy and are willing to hold their leaders accountable to it. In today's circumstances, Vladimir Putin is less constrained, whether by law or by ideas or by institutions, than any Russian ruler of the 20th century. Putin is unconstrained by a legal system that has been reduced to a farce. There are no truly independent courts or independent press left in Russia today. There is no genuine pluralistic system of competing political parties, although there is a facsimile of one. The Russian parliament exercises no meaningful constraint on what the Kremlin can and cannot do. There is not even a Politburo that demands some version of collective leadership to which Brezhnev was subject in the 1970s and early 80s. And finally, on a symbolic level, Vladimir Putin is not even constrained by being part of a visible family. He is not even embedded in the most elemental human community of all, which is the human family. He is truly a solo operator, unconstrained symbolically, institutionally, by any mechanism you might imagine. This is an extremely dangerous circumstance. And I don't think the war against Ukraine would have happened without that kind of solo practitioner role that Putin has managed to create for himself. And at some point, I think Russians will wake up to the fact that they have had to pay and will pay a tremendous price for the lack of any kind of constraints on this solo operator. And that's where I think Sakharov's ideas, both of human rights being embedded in the practice of statecraft, but also of competition in the form of multi-party democracy being an essential safeguard of state decision-making, will once again rise to the surface. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for this very thought-provoking remarks and the lots that we could ponder here.